Hello, everyone. If you cannot hear me, please just let me know in the chat and I will try and work. Hello, everyone. So I got started a minute ago, but everyone couldn't hear me. So I'm going to give it a couple of seconds. Please let me know if you can hear me now. Okay, so this webinar series that we are doing is to give people a foundational education on the different departments within the pharmaceutical industry. We realize that it's not something that is obvious or known, especially as you're going through pharmacy school. So it's to help you in case you are looking to go into pharma or just want to get an understanding, to really give you that foundational understanding. Again, the series, we started with clinical development last week, and reg affairs will be next week. This week we'll focus on pharmacovigilance. And again, we're going to focus on the functional areas and not necessarily the fellowship per se. We will be having webinars in the fall closer to mid-year that will go over more of the fellowship process and interviews and all of that. So this one is mainly about the functional area. Please feel free to type in any of your questions into the chat, and I will try and go over that at the end of this presentation. So this presentation is slated to go until about 6:45. It's just going to be a quick presentation, about 15 minutes, and then the next 15 minutes, 20 minutes, I will try and answer your questions. So as a way of presentation, my name is Abimbola Cole. I am going into my second year of my fellowship in global pharmacovigilance with MCPHS and Takeda Pharmaceuticals. My fellowship is in all the functional areas that Takeda specializes in, and Takeda has products in GI, CNS, oncology, and vaccines. Although the fellowship is technically in all therapeutic areas, I mainly work and sit within the oncology area. I am a graduate of MCPHS Boston campus as well. So just a little tidbit about what I do. Now to move on to the remainder of the presentation. Quick disclaimer, the opinions and views of these slides are my own, and they do not necessarily reflect the opinions of MCPHS University or Takeda Pharmaceuticals. The objectives for today, it's going to go over important definitions. We will explain the history of PV. We're going to discuss international PV organizations. We will highlight the scope of PV, as well as discuss major processes within PV, mainly signal detection. So what is pharmacovigilance? The World Health Organization defines it as the science and activities relating to the detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse effects or any other drug-related problem. Another definition that has been used is the mechanism and tests that together map and ensure the safety of medicine throughout its lifespan from test tube to patient. And I particularly like this second definition because it really highlights that this is a continuous and lifelong process for a product. As long as the product is on the market, from the moment it is discovered till the end of the product, pharmacovigilance activities are conducted. The underlying goals of PV. So the main thing is preventing harm from adverse reactions, as well as promoting the safe and effective use of medicinal products. Important terms. So in pharma in general, you have a lot of acronyms and abbreviations, and they can be particular to the industry, and they can be particular to the company. Now, in addition to that, we have a lot of abbreviations and acronyms that we use within pharmacovigilance. And because it's a highly regulated industry, it's very important that you know the definitions of each term and you don't mix them up. So something like an adverse event, any untoward medical occurrence, whereas an adverse drug reaction, it's the same thing, but with an adverse drug reaction, we are kind of implying causality, saying that this adverse event, it's not only an adverse event, but it's an adverse event that we think is related to this product. Suspected adverse drug reaction, and then medicinal product. Again, we know what a medicinal product is, but there's a particular definition that goes with it, just things to be aware of. And then serious AE or AR. The seriousness has key criteria, so it has to result in death, it has to be life-threatening, either requires inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of an existing hospitalization. It can result in persistent or significant disability, a congenital anomaly or defect. And so it has to be anyone to be considered serious. There's also the possibility that if it does not fit in that criteria, if it's considered an important medical event, that could still possibly be considered a serious AE or AR. A signal, this is one of the staples of pharmacovigilance. So essentially any new or potential association for your product. And then signal management is a set of activities that we're determining if there's a new risk with the product. So now on to the history of pharmacovigilance. I am a history buff. I love history. And so I guess that's probably one of the things that attracted me to pharmacovigilance as well, because it has a pretty cool history. So let's get into that. 1901 St. Louis and Camden, New Jersey contamination event. So in 1901, 13 children in St. Louis died from a contaminated diphtheria toxoid. And there were also tetanus outbreaks in Camden, New Jersey, due to a contaminated smallpox vaccine. And essentially what happened was the horse that was used to make the diphtheria antitoxin died of tetanus. However, the antitoxin that was produced from that horse was not thrown away. And so you get these outbreaks. Again, like a lot of things, our regulations are a result of some type of negative tragedy that happens. And that is the same thing with pharmacovigilance. So you have this happen in 1901. 1902, we have the Biologics Control Act. So was to control the quality of vaccine production. 1906, Pure Food and Drug Act. I'm sure many of you have seen this. What was reported in the Jungle by Upton Sinclair really pushed Congress to pass the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, which was focused on the manufacture, sale, transportation, misbranding of products. 1937, we have the elixir sulfanilamide incident. This was typically in tablet form. However, they created an elixir for it, and typically, if you're going from tablet to a liquid, you're trying to improve administration. This is going to typically affect your pediatrics, your children population. So it resulted in over 100 deaths in 15 states and affected mainly children. And so this led to our 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so manufacturers were required to show the drug is safe before it could be marketed. In addition to this, they're required to submit an application to the FDA before marketing a drug. So they're required to submit a NDA, a new drug application. And then we have thalidomide, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. At the end, around World War II, you had this the sleeping pill that came in for sleeplessness and anxiety. It's marketed first in Germany, I believe, and heavily sold throughout Europe. By the 1960s, started seeing children born with physical disabilities, most notably phocomelia. The drug never entered the US as a marketed product due to Dr. Kelsley, and she noticed that there were the safety profile of the drug was lacking. So then we're going to go over now we're going to go over international bodies which govern pharmacovigilance. We have the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, CIOMS. This was developed in 1949 by the World Health Organization and UNESCO to bring members of the scientific community together. And it sets international standards for scientific activities. And since the early 1980s, it's had a division dedicated to drug safety. The CIOMS has guidelines addressing a number of drug safety issues, and these include things such as management of safety information in clinical trials, development safety update reports. So a number of reports and forms that we use are based off of CIOMS. Next, we have in response to the thalidomide, the World Health Organization created a drug monitoring program in 1968. And it initially only had about 10 countries, and now it has 134 participating countries. And this database that the World Health Organization that's used from the World Health Organization today is called VigiBase. And we get a lot of our adverse events from this database. Then we have the International Council for Harmonization. This was developed indirectly as a result of thalidomide. Its inception was in 1990, consisted of Europe, Japan, and the EU. The focus was initially on safety, quality, and efficacy guidelines. However, the scope gradually shifted and is shifting to other activities such as medical dictionary and the common technical document. So essentially, you had an increase in regulations in the 60s and 70s after the thalidomide incident. This increase in regulation also coincided with the increase in the global drug market and globalization. And so you really wanted to harmonize a number of aspects of the drug approval process. And that's where you get this council that came together. And most recently, they have been pushing to enter into emerging markets as well. So it started off with these 3 major markets, but now is moving into other territories. So now that we've gone over the history of PV, going to go through the scope of it. So I like to break it down into internal and external scope. So internal scope, we have PV operations, which consists of PV compliance, PV case processing, and PV training. And then we have medical safety and risk management. Then the external scope, clinical, post-marketing, and post-exclusivity. And for internal scope, PV operations, essentially, they deal with how do you collect all the cases. So you have a lot of medicinal products on the market. You have a lot of patients that are on it. And so you're going to have a number of reports that are coming in from when the product's on the market and from reports coming in from clinical trials. So you need a solid process in place that will streamline this and really get all those reports in a timely manner. So that's what PV Ops is mainly doing. Medical safety, my fellowship is mainly in medical safety and risk management. I don't deal really with PV operations, but medical safety is involved in signal detection. So it's assessing on a regular basis data, and that's coming from adverse events, reports. And so you're assessing all of these things and you're looking for anything that seems out of the ordinary, out of what it's expected for your product. And then essentially that's a signal. So you're looking for those. And you're trying to see, is it a real signal, assessing validity of that. Risk management, you are looking at the risk and benefits of your product and implementing risk minimization efforts to increase the benefit of your product and decrease its risk. And then for the external scope, it's essentially just saying pharmacovigilance is involved from phase 1 all the way to the end. So I'm going to focus more on signal management and just quickly go through that. So I said medical safety does signal detection. So you get a signal, you're going to validate that signal. Is it a real signal? Is it not? You're going to prioritize it and then assess it. And then you're going to try and recommend it for some type of action. Where does this information come from? So signals come from various resources. These include spontaneous reports, clinical studies, scientific literature, epidemiology studies. Really, signals can come from anywhere. And we have databases that aggregate these ones. So we have spontaneous reporting systems. Each company will have their own database that's going to mine and assess signals. And then you have other database sources. So national databases such as the FDA FAERS. You have Vigilance, which is a EMA, so European Medicines Administration Association database. And then Vigibase, like I mentioned earlier, is a database that is employed by the World Health Organization. And then you prioritize these signals depending on impact. So you're considering the severity, the seriousness, the outcome, reversibility, exposure to vulnerable populations, consequences of the treatment, discontinuation, availability of other treatment options, and extent of regulatory intervention. So with that, that is just a brief overview of pharmacovigilance. Now just going to head into questions. So I'll try and answer as many questions as possible. And if you have any more questions, you can email them to this email here, pharmdfellowships@mcphs.edu. Okay, so I have a question of what do I enjoy most about my job and what do I like least about my job? So what I enjoy most about my job, I love drug safety. As a pharmacist, it seemed almost like the direct route of it. I remember working in hospital and working in retail, and I would get questions from a doctor or nurses or patients saying, does this drug cause sleeplessness? Does it cause nausea? Does it cause various things? Can I use this drug with eating? Can I use this drug with this medication? And so I would always go into the databases or go into the clinical trials, go into the label to get this information. And I knew it was coming from the company. So I always thought, okay, how do they figure this out? And I wanted to go from the beginning. So essentially, I love it because it's like I'm a detective. I'm looking for possible signals within a product, and it's always putting the patient first. Every day I know that's what I'm doing. What do I like least about it? Honestly, there's nothing that I can say that I do not like about it. I guess it's the thing I would say is it's hard to capture every single thing. So social media is a interesting aspect. people can report adverse events on social media, but currently there isn't a very standardized way to capture this. So just something that we can improve upon, but honestly, I love everything about it. Another question here, one moment. Okay. Do I apply clinical knowledge from my pharmacy education background as a PV fellow? I would say absolutely. I apply my clinical knowledge. However, it's applied in a different way than you would in, I guess, in a more like an internal med or a clinical setting. So my pharmacy background allows me to understand the diseases and the mechanisms of the drug. I would say that's probably one of the strongest points for it, and coming in with that knowledge. Since I deal with oncology, I'm aware of what the general adverse events of oncology products are, and I know how that affects patients as well. I think for a pharmacist, we've been in practice, whether it's just rotations or working, and you've seen that patient, so you know what they're willing to, the risks they're willing to take as well. I think that patient perspective with my clinical knowledge is really beneficial here. Additionally, I guess I know the adverse events that are acceptable. So with risk management, we look at the benefits and risks. Oncology, we're willing to accept certain things such as hair loss. We're willing to accept certain things such as like GI ulcers. Those are the mechanisms, things that you typically accept for oncology, but you wouldn't necessarily accept those risks for a hypertension medication. So stuff like that is just, it's that knowledge that gives me a foundation and a background. That being said, it does differ from your clinical pharmacy. It involves a lot of use of your soft skills, your process management, your project management skills. So a lot of different things besides clinical. Okay, let me see. Okay, one of the questions was, what do I consider reliable source for an adverse drug reaction or an adverse event? So a source can be anywhere, really. You never want to negate a source. Again, there may be levels. If you're having a report from clinical trials that you're running, that is a legitimate source because you're running that. They're required to report. However, if you're getting a source from maybe a call-in center, you have to, and it's coming maybe from a caregiver, it's still a reliable source, but because you do not know the whole setting of that adverse event, it becomes a bit more difficult. So I would say you have to assume everything is reliable because you never want to say, oh, I'm going to negate this, and it could be a serious adverse event. Additionally, there are certain requirements. So we have something called individual ICSR, so individual case safety reports. So any type of spontaneous report goes under that, and it has to meet a criteria. So you have to have a reporter, you have to have a patient, you have to have a related medicinal product, and you have to have an adverse event. So it has to reach those 4 criteria. If it doesn't reach that, then you cannot have it reported as an ICSR. Doesn't mean that you ignore it, but that just means that it doesn't go into that certain streamlined process. So I would say sources come from so many different areas, and it's mainly about looking at the seriousness of it. causality, and if it meets those certain criteria. How does PV fit into the drug development process? Do you work mostly in phase 4 or through the clinical trial? So again, like I mentioned earlier, I really enjoy PV because it is a life cycle process. We do not, our activities don't really ramp up, let's say when you're going, filing for an NDA or when the product is getting into its pivotal phase. We are involved from test tube all the way to the end because that's how you develop your safety profile. In order for a drug to be marketed and approved by regulatory bodies, it has to be safe and efficacious. So you cannot even get to phase 4 without proving the safety profile. So PV is involved in all phases. That being said, it's going to vary by therapeutic area in terms of the patients you have in clinical trials. So for a phase 1 study, first in human, you won't have as many patients, and so you're not assessing that much data. Whereas as you ramp up into phase 3, you're increasing the amount of patients you have. And then if you hit post-marketing, if you were only testing this drug in, let's say, 1,000 patients, it hits post-marketing, that can reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of patients in the next 10 years. So the amount of data you're assessing will increase as you progress from phase 1 all the way to phase 4. But we are involved in all of the processes, and I would say it's equally important. I wouldn't say pharmacovigilance in phase 4 is more important than phase 1. I would say they're equally important. Our PV fellowships usually specialize in the internal, external scopes, or do you do a little bit of everything during the course of the fellowship? So PV fellowships will vary by company, and that's something that you should check the description as well when you're looking through their brochure. My fellowship focuses in medical safety and risk management. Some PV fellowships only focus in medical safety, and then some are operational PV fellowships. So it varies. And although I focus mainly in medical safety and risk management, I have been heavily involved in PV operation projects as well, because it does affect how I do my medical safety job. So you don't work in silos, although you may be focused in one area. You are aware of what's going on in the other departments, and you will have meetings together as well. So definitely able to learn about the process, but your fellowship may not be focused in that particular area, but all fellowships are different. So it's just something of you determining what you are more interested in, and then streamlining your fellowship choice to fit that. Okay. What % of my day spent looking at data versus reacting to reports and making recommendations? So I would say we're constantly assessing data, but in different ways. As a PV scientist role in medical safety, one thing we do is monthly signal detection. So monthly, we run a report on our databases that assesses all of the reports that reported to us, clinical trials. It assesses literature, anything that was reported in the literature, and we get a huge Excel sheet of all that data. We assess that data, we pull out important information of it, and at Takeda, that's presented on a monthly basis to a global safety team. I say that you're constantly assessing data, but in different ways, because looking at that Excel sheet, you may not look at it for more than a couple of days to create that PowerPoint. However, you're constantly thinking of, if you did have a signal, then you're going to be discussing that signal and looking at more information about that signal with your global safety lead or with the GST. Or you're working on a report, an aggregate report that requires a cumulative amount of data. So you're constantly looking at data and maneuvering it, but in different ways. Sometimes you're more analytical. So there's some times that you're more analytical on data, and there's some times that you're more focused on the process of the data. So I would say it's hard to say that I am more analytical of data 75% of the time, and I'm focused on the process of the data 30% of the time. It really just depends on what's going on with the product. If we are getting close to submitting one of our aggregate reports, something called like a PIECER, then I may be more involved in the process of it. If there's a signal, then I may be more involved in the analyzing the data and doing epi report. So it just depends on the product. And reacting to reports, it depends on what you mean by reacting to reports. Assessing it is a certain way of reacting because we're making sure that there's nothing there that we missed. But again, it will depend on the product and the life cycle of the product in terms of if you need to change anything to a label or create send out a Dear Healthcare Provider letter. Okay. There's some questions about travel. So pharmacovigilance does not do a lot of traveling. It's just not, we don't really need to do that in order to do our job well. That being said, we do have the opportunity to go to conferences that are related to our functional area and beneficial. So in the beginning of my fellowship, I had the opportunity to go to the FDA in Maryland, and I attended an FDA public meeting. I'm going to a conference called DIA. This year it's based in Boston, and past years it's been based in Chicago. So if it wasn't Chicago, I would travel there. There's a lot of different drug safety conferences as well. There's also conferences that are about particular therapeutic areas. So they have a lot of oncology conferences. They have a lot of blood cancer conferences or breast cancer conferences. So you have the opportunity to attend those conferences, but I wouldn't say that this is a area within the pharmaceutical industry that you do a lot of traveling. Sorry if I'm for like moments of gaps. I'm just looking through your questions. Okay. There's some pre-questions on, are pharmacovigilance positions partially or fully remote? So MSL's roles, yes, are fully remote. But even that depends on the company. I would say pharmacovigilance, you will rarely have a fully remote pharmacovigilance position. That being said, it's heavily dependent on the company. I have heard of cases of safety officers that you only come into the office or the company maybe like once a month, and you do everything through like email correspondence. So that depends on the company and the type of position as well. We have something called drug safety officers, DSOs, that work in local operating companies. So essentially those are safety offices in like countries in Latin America, countries in the Middle East. So those ones are local in that they are just they're an affiliate of our company, but they're not physically based in Cambridge because they're focused on the safety in their country. So that's a type of remote. But yeah, it's based on the company. Okay. Let's see. In terms of requirements of the fellowship, again, those are the things that will be on our website and will be on each company's brochure as well, but will be kind of addressed in the later webinars that are coming in the fall. How many pharmacists work in PV? In my particular fellowship, there are a number of pharmacists in the pharmacovigilance department. My two preceptors are pharmacists. We have former fellows that are working here as well. So there's a good representation of pharmacists in the pharmacovigilance department here. Average annual life of a pharmacovigilance fellow. You ask any fellow that, and they won't be able to give you a very straightforward answer simply because there isn't an average day. I live by my calendar, and my meetings vary. Some days I can have just one meeting, and I have hours just to get some work done. Some days I have about 4 meetings scheduled back to back. It depends. We have certain things that come on a regular basis. So we have at least for here, a monthly safety meeting. We have a quarterly safety meeting. Sometimes you have ad hoc meetings, depending on what projects you're running that could meet separately. That's something that's fellowship specific is I have weekly meetings with one of my preceptors and twice monthly meetings with the other one of my preceptors. So those are something that's regularly scheduled, but really my day varies a lot. Sometimes I could look at my calendar Sunday evening and then I get into the office on Monday morning and I have another meeting else put on my calendar. So just depends. So do I have a meeting that could possibly impact current drug policy? So that one is a bit, so drug policy. The stuff that we do, I wouldn't say would affect drug policy directly. Could possibly affect standard of care. I think in general, pharmaceutical industry as a whole can definitely affect drug policy. Absolutely, but that is something that's more indirect. There are possibly functions within the pharmaceutical industry that deal mainly with drug policy, maybe regulatory affairs, because they're dealing more with FDA. But in changing the policy, I wouldn't say we have regular meetings on changing drug policy. I know regulatory bodies do ask input from pharmaceutical companies on certain things, so that will affect how they make certain policies or recommendations. So that's definitely a possibility. But in my day-to-day, I don't really get involved with meetings that have that will affect drug policy. What activities did I partake in pharmacy school that helped me prepare for a PV fellowship? I was heavily involved in a number of groups on campus. I was part of SNAPHA, Student National Pharmaceutical Association. I think that really gave me, I was the HIV AIDS, Remember the Ribbon Coordinator. I think doing that gave me good project management skills and delegating tasks. I worked as a pharmacy intern in both a hospital and in retail for quite a number of years. I think that allowed me to get a community practice experience as well as clinical experience that I could bring to the fellowship as well. I think it just rounded me out. So I think getting involved in clubs and organizations allowed me the opportunity to present, and presentation skills are necessary. Project management, which is very necessary. It helped me become, I guess, very fluid in that you have to be willing and able to adapt. Environments change, paces change, and you have to know how to work with that. And then again, working, it just rounds you out. So I would say that that's kind of how it helped me prepare. Okay, let's see. Background about Takeda Pharmaceuticals. Takeda is a Japanese company. So we have a huge presence in Japan and Asia. And it's actually over 200 years old, which again is another reason why I love this company. I love history. I like the fact that it had that aspect to it. I guess a little more background on it. We have things called Takeda-isms, and they're really focused on the patient and on integrity. And I could really get a sense of that from when I interviewed with the company. I really feel like they do put the patient first. So the culture here is very inclusive and supportive, which I do love. And I mean, I can only say like I've been having a great time in my fellowship and in my functional area. What happens after you complete a fellowship, then you are done. Yeah, it's what happens after you complete any type of program, after you graduate, then you are able to go into that functional area in which you did your fellowship in. Some people switch to another functional area. They make a lateral transition. Some people decide they don't want to do industry and they go into clinical or retail. So really it's just what you want to do after. That's what you'll go into. Okay, let me see. What are my experience working with other teams, such as regulatory and medical affairs? PV liaises with various groups within pharmaceutical industry. So on our monthly meetings, we have representation from clinical development and clinical sciences. We have representation from pharmacoepi, from regulatory. So regulatory is constantly involved in the process. So is pharmacoepi. So we liaise with a number of groups on a regular basis. Same thing with non-clinical, medical affairs as well. So it just depends on the time frame of the product, where it is in its cycle. But in general, we liaise with, I want to say essentially, not everyone, but a good amount of functional areas within the industry on a regular basis. Okay, so with that, I'm going to end this webinar. Thank you guys for attending. Thank you for your questions. I hope this was helpful. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send it to that email that's on this slide. And have a good night. Thank you.